Thanks for sticking around. I have already heard drought come up a number of times this morning, so I'm going to run you through a little post-mortem on what we've seen this year so far as the development of the drought and kind of what we expect to see going forward and how we're kind of managing it from a statewide perspective. So thanks for the opportunity. So we get a lot of questions whenever a drought hits as far as how does this rank, how is this in comparison? I mean, we all have our qualitative assessments of this is the worst we've ever seen, or oh, it was way worse in year, whatever. But thankfully we have great data to support where we are quantitatively. And so we know that so far for our water year, and almost everything I talk about today is going to be in our water year, so October 1st through year to date, we're currently tied for the second warmest in 123-year record. Now, this isn't too shocking. We know that Colorado has warmed 2 degrees in the last 30 years and 2.5, and 2.5 in the last 50. So we're on a warming trend as is, but the second warmest with only 1933 and 1934 being warmer, and that is through July. So we don't have the final August numbers in, but my guess is it's probably going to be around the same. But how that manifests doesn't really play out equally across the state. What we've seen in the state of Colorado so far throughout this water year is we've seen record highs being broken, but we've also set some records for low temperatures too. But what we're seeing more frequently than not is that our record low temperatures or our low temperature daily temperatures are higher than they have historically been. So we're not cooling off as much during the night as we would normally cool off. And that certainly has implications for a number of things, but certainly within the growing season and the agricultural sector as well. The Southwest Colorado, and we heard this from Bruce, has been really heavily impacted. It has been hot, it has been dry, and it has been like that since last fall. What we have seen in this summer is that while some areas of the state have gotten some monsoonal precipitation, and I'll go into precipitation in a second, we've really seen a drying out of northwest Colorado, and a lot of this has been driven by temperatures. Northwest Colorado has been experiencing temperatures about 5 degrees above average throughout the summer, and this, no matter what is happening with precipitation, results in drying things out. And so that drying, that warming trend has really been driving the water conditions throughout Colorado this year. You can see in general, the West Slope has been much warmer than the Eastern Plains throughout this season. And here's just another way of looking at it as far as departure from normal. You can see that the Eastern Plains in some areas have actually been below normal. Those are some of those low temperatures I was talking about. But the high temperatures have really been grabbing the headlines across the Western Slope. So precip, everyone wants to know about precip because while temperature is certainly a driver here, precipitation does matter. And surprisingly, we're only the 5th driest in a 123-year record. Depending on where you're from in the state, this might be shocking to you, or you might completely understand it. My guess is if you're in Akron, you probably are like, oh yeah, that makes sense. If you're in Cortez, you probably feel a little bit different. But what that looks like statewide isn't telling the whole story, right? Here's our statewide snowpack. You look at this and you say, yeah, it doesn't look really good, but then how that plays out across the state is very, very different. So this is our snow water equivalent from May, so this is towards the end of the snowpack year. Unfortunately, by this time of the year, we had already seen meltout happen across most of the southern states. We saw meltout happen about a month early. And we essentially saw no uptick in stream flow within some of these southern streams. And you can see how that plays out in the southern portion of the state. The northern half looks not great, but relatively speaking, in a year like this, 62% of average isn't awful. But then you look down in the southwest corner in the San Juan, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan, and you see 6%, and it's all a little bit relative. So how does that play out as far as reservoir storage? Well, I want to give you a sense of where we were at the beginning of the year. So again, this is May 1 reservoir storage, and this actually wasn't our highest reservoir storage of the year. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll show you what our highest reservoir storage was in a couple slides, but not the next slide. But we started off the year really, really well with reservoir storage. We had above average reservoir storage in all basins of the state for the first time in a long time. For a long time, the Rio was really struggling to be above average or even near normal for reservoir storage, but it made it there. It was doing great. And then we realized that with these high temperatures, with the lack of the inflow to the reservoirs, demand was going to uptick. We were already hearing from agricultural producers that they just didn't have the soil moisture to plant in some areas. And we were already seeing in April fires. In 4 days, 4 hot, windy days in April, we burned our average annual burned acreage in the state of Colorado. That was April. That was before the Springs fire, before 416, before Burrow, before any of the other various and sundry fires we've had this year. And so with that, the Water Availability Task Force, which is our monitoring arm of the state's drought mechanism, recommended to the Drought Task Force that the governor activate the state drought mitigation and response plan. Colorado's really lucky. We were one of the first states in the nation to have a drought plan in the 80s. We put it up on a shelf. It did a really good job acting as a model for many other states and collecting dust until about 2002 when we realized we were woefully unprepared. And at that point, we realized we needed to take a more active role. And we now have the most comprehensive state drought mitigation and response plan in the nation. And we have not only acted as a model for other states, but other countries as to how to take proactive drought planning and collaboration, which is a big piece of our drought plan, into consideration. And so we took early steps to respond to this drought. And with that, the governor kicked off the Drought Task Force, which is a cabinet-level task force, as well as the Agricultural Impact Task Force. And so we have been meeting and responding to conditions. We did a drought tour in Durango, in the Durango area in July, bringing down high-level decision makers to really hear from folks and see what a D4, what exceptional drought looks like on the ground. Those efforts are going to continue through the duration of this event, and right now we are actually looking at whether or not we need to expand drought activation to some of the more northern counties, the Moffats, the Grands, that have been really heavily impacted by those hot, warm conditions, hot, dry conditions over the last 2 months. So with regard to precipitation, in the whole water year, you can see that we have this massive drying trend over the Four Corners and up to the northwest Colorado, but then in northeastern Colorado, we have great rain. Now, or we've had great precipitation. Now, unfortunately, some of that precipitation has fallen in the form of hail. So when it comes to overall production, our production numbers are pretty low. We've had a number of 4-inch hail events. Is anyone in the Fountain, Colorado Springs? Yeah. My roof has to get replaced too, and that was only from a 3-inch hail event. So unfortunately, the precipitation isn't really falling how we need it to fall, even if it is falling in some of these regions. As far as a percent of normal, again, it's following the same patterns. That northeastern corner doing all right, the northwestern and southern, or the western and southern half of the state is struggling. But as far as monsoon season goes, so in monsoon season, which usually starts around July 15th, Colorado gets a lot of benefit typically from the monsoon season. Most of our major floods have happened during this season. I shouldn't say beneficial moisture and floods in the same sentence. But most of our heavy precipitation events do happen during this season. It usually runs July, roughly, it depends on where in the state you are, but roughly from July 15th through mid-September. And we started to see some really beneficial moisture in July, and especially on the Eastern Plains. This is a different type of map because I couldn't pull the other one down off the website, but this is August to date, so you can see again we're seeing some great moisture in southwestern Colorado. We've had like 1-inch rain events in Grand Junction this week, which is great. So we are seeing some benefit from the monsoon season, but we're not necessarily seeing it in the places where it's the warmest and the hottest. And I would also say that large rain events on burn scars do not result in benefit. And I'll talk a little bit more about impacts going forward. So even with those rain events, those beneficial rain events, usually we'd be pretty excited about a 1-inch event. So Grand Junction area got about 1 to 1.5 inches over the last couple of days. They are still tracking record low on the Grand Mesa. So this is a map looking at the water year to date precipitation, so October 1st to date, and I just pulled this down yesterday, so it includes anything that happened through, I think, 6 a.m. yesterday. All of the red dots are lowest gauges on record, or lowest snow-tell sites on record, and the yellow are second lowest. So you can see, not just in the southwest corner, but across much of western Colorado, we are seeing record-breaking low precipitation for the water year as a whole. This has been a very persistent drought event for the last 10 months. So here's where we are with reservoir storage now. You can see that in the southwest, in the San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan, reservoir storage has dropped over 60%. Since the beginning of the season. The Gunnison has also dropped. The Rio dropped and then has actually come back a little bit with some of the monsoon moisture, which is good. But we are seeing just a rapid decline in reservoir storage because it's been hot and there's demand on those reservoirs. At the same time, those users are not necessarily getting all the water that they want. We've had reports of agricultural folks having to haul water since early July. And so we really are having to manage those resources in a very thoughtful manner to ensure that we have water going forward, because we don't know what the winter is going to hold. So to put that in a slightly different version, this is really horrible to see, but you can basically just see the downward trend. Look at the Arkansas, look at the basins of the Southwest. You can see the bounce back in the Rio. You can see the downward trend in the Gunnison. As we get hot and dry, we just have less available water and we see more demand. And once these reservoirs drop down, it's really difficult to come back, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. But again, the story is not just a statewide story. Some have been hotter and drier and have been struggling more than others. Down in that Southwest basin, this is looking at month-on-month precipitation. July, they had a really good month in July, 81% of average. That's what we're calling a really good month this year. August to date, only 23% of average. And again, temperatures have been above average. You can see over on the end, water year 2002. You can see how we stack up to 2002. We have 6 weeks left of this water year. And for this basin to recover to normal precipitation, it would take over 500% of average over the next 6 weeks. Not only do we not want that to happen because that is flooding, it's statistically impossible. And this isn't the only basin in the state. The Gunnison, I think, is at 524% of average to reach normal precipitation levels for the water year. So we are tracking along with record lows across much of western Colorado this year. And this is just one more way of showing what that reservoir drop looks like. And if you look at past events, how long it takes to recover from those very precipitous declines in storage. So along with increasing demand and decreasing reservoir storage, we've also seen increases in evaporative demand. Again, I started with temperature for a reason, because temperature is really driving a lot of what is happening with water availability in Colorado. It is one thing to have a drought, but to have a hot drought paints a very, very different picture. So this is looking at just one site for the evaporative demand for the growing season, where we are currently tracking higher than our maximum ET demand for the year. So again, really hot, thirsty atmosphere. That's one way we talk about it, is this is the thirstiest year at this location. That's partly driven by temperature, partly driven by wind, but also when you have less rain events, you have less cloud cover and you have more sun. So all of these things work together. So this is just looking at it from official drought indices instead of just looking at percemperature. That's a new way of saying precipitation and temperature together. You guys like that? So instead of just looking at temperature and precipitation, some of these compound indices look at drought on a whole, and this is taking into account a number of different effects, but you can really see in July that drying out in northwestern Colorado and the impacts that has had. As far as water availability goes, looking at stream flows, this is our SWASI index. You can see that we are extremely dry across the vast majority of the state. There are some areas in the lower arc that are being dominated by storage, John Martin. And even up in northwestern Colorado, Stagecoach, there's a lot of energy water rights held in Stagecoach, and we know from past drought events that they tend to hold on to those water rights because they don't know how long the event will last, and that can drive up water storage in those buckets, but it's not necessarily available water storage. So as far as drought, here's where we are today, and I'd like to point out that we've actually had some improvements in some areas of the state over the last month. You can see in the Arkansas, we've seen some improvements not only in the last month, but the last 2 months. But you can also see that we've seen some degradations over the last 2 months. So you can see expansion in that northwest corner on the 1 month scale, but as well on the 2 month scale. You can actually see that in some areas, we've seen a 3-class degradation over a 2 month period. That's a pretty rapid decline in conditions across the state. And so that's the area that we're watching really closely. We're also watching that area really closely because of what our winter holds, and I will get to that in just 1 second. Almost all of Colorado has some sort of secretarial designation from the USDA for drought. There's a few pockets. I think there's like 12 counties where we do not have secretarial drought designations. I think all 12 of those counties have hail designations. So if you look at it as a whole, Colorado is having a rough year as far as disaster with regard to USDA in the state of Colorado. Uh-oh. Oh. I always forget when I put in animations. So what is happening as far as impacts? You got to laugh a little bit more, guys. It's like the day 3 of a 3-day event. It's between me, you. I'm between you and lunch. Come on. So we've seen large amounts of both prevented planting in the state, but we've also seen large acreages of failure in the state. And so that's, as of mid-July, that was the reporting date. We do have some late reporters, so we expect these numbers to uptick just a little bit going forward. These operate not on the water year and not on the calendar year, but on the fiscal year for the federal government, which actually is the same as the water year. So this round will actually be the complete year. So anything that happens after October 1st won't be counted as part of 2018. We are seeing cattle sell-off. Hay prices right now are really high, and when you're being impacted by hail and drought, there is not a lot of available hay, and so we're looking at how do we transport hay from areas that there is hay, Montana, Idaho, those areas. How do we get that into the state? But then that's a cost. It's a huge burden for producers. So how do we do that? We're seeing an uptick in cattle sales. We are seeing fish kills. I know Bruce mentioned this. We've seen some really massive fish kills, not just in southwestern Colorado, but across much of the state. We see more widespread voluntary fishing restrictions this year than we've seen in the past. We of course have seen fires, and we have seen floods on those burn scars that have resulted in water quality impacts to the watersheds, debris flows, and all of those have economic impacts. And the driver behind these has been drought. So we are looking at quantifying that. We're going to be working with our university partners to quantify what those economic impacts have been with regard to agriculture, which is what we're activated for, but also tourism and rec, because we've seen some really widespread tourism and recreation impacts this year. So on that cheery note, what do we have to look forward in the future? So currently we're in a neutral conditions. We were in a La Nina. We have shifted to neutral conditions. And right now the forecast is for 70% chance of El Nino developing by late fall, 60% by kind of early fall. But most of the models are telling us that we're going to move into an El Nino from neutral conditions. So what does that mean for the state of Colorado? This is where we've been in the past. Pick your favorite snow year, see where it is. I think that the major message is that it really depends on where you are in the state of Colorado as to whether or not you benefit from an El Nino. Because I'm gonna go ahead and then come back. Because for an El Nino, what it typically means is that we are wetter to the south and drier to the north, but where that line falls in Colorado is anyone's guess. In 2011, it fell right on I-70, and so we had flooding in the north and record snowpack in the north and drought in the south, but that's not always the case. We just don't necessarily know how it's going to fall. We also don't necessarily know the extent to how strong the El Nino is going to be. Forecasts right now are for a pretty mild El Nino, so these little bumps. But what we see is that some of the major events that we have happen when an event is stronger. So a mild El Nino event doesn't necessarily mean that just because it's El Nino, we're going to see people jumping off their roofs in Crested Butte because the snowpack is so deep that they can do that. I'm hoping for that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see that. And so the extent of the event is what matters. How early it comes on also matters. The earlier we start getting moisture, the better we usually do. And so the CPC, the Climate Prediction Center for NOAA, is actually predicting above average chances of good precipitation for at least southwestern Colorado and much of western Colorado. Again, a lot of this is I think September, October, November, so this is into the fall season. A lot of this is still being driven by the monsoons, which we'll continue to see in September. But then look at the temperature. Again, this above average temperature across the US, but especially within the Four Corners region, which has really been the epicenter of this event. So how that temperature threshold falls really has an impact on our precipitation as far as whether or not it's falling as rain or snow. And we'll see how that plays out going forward. But this is through November, and so right now, possibly warm and wet, which is better than warm and dry, but not necessarily cold and wet, which would get some good snowpack on the ground as well. So I think what we can say for southwestern Colorado is that the drought is not likely to get worse. Northwest Colorado, we're watching. It's a little more dicey up there. We're gonna wait and see what happens. We're keeping a really close eye on conditions there, and hoping for an early onset of precipitation for the snowpack season going forward. So with that, I can answer any questions. But you're gonna have to just yell it out because I can't see you. All right?